The Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were clearly written by, well, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? That's what Christians, or at least the majority of them, claim and believe. Yet scholars, or at least the majority of them, claim something different. They claim that the Gospels were actually anonymous, and when they were first passed around, they were anonymous, and they were only later attributed to the traditional authors. So who's right? Well, today, we're going to put the Gospels on trial and determine what the evidence shows. And you are the jury. Let's get ready for court. All rise for the Honorable Judge Wordroom. All right, let's get this started. The prosecution can make its opening statement. Absolutely, Your Honor. Oh, wait, I'm not dressed for court. That's better. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm Mr. Lack of Facts, and I am representing the scholars. Today, the Gospels stand accused of being anonymous, and I'm going to lay out the evidence and show you why the scholars have a virtual consensus on this. Defense, your opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm Mr. All the Facts, and I'm here representing the traditional Christian view. I'm going to expose the evidence, and I'm going to show you why Mr. Lack of Facts is truly lacking the facts to support the claim that the Gospels are anonymous. The evidence is going to show that we have strong reasons to believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels attributed to them. So let's get to it. Well then, let's call my first witness. I call the scholars to the stand, and I will introduce our first piece of evidence in support of anonymity.
It is factually wrong to say that most New Testament scholars think that the Gospels are written by people that we know who wrote these Gospels. It's factually wrong. Most New Testament scholars say we don't know that they in fact are anonymous writers. They certainly were not the disciples of Jesus. That is by far the widest opinion.
What's really significant here is that all of our Gospels were originally anonymous works. They did not have the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John on them. They only put those names on as soon as somebody came across two Gospels and they said, well, this Gospel is different from this one, so what do we call it?
3, the Gospels are ultimately based on the memories of anonymous persons.
So as you can see, it is simply a fact that the scholars agree on this. You know, the scholars who are educated on this topic, they all agree the Gospels were anonymous. No further questions. Defense, would you like to cross-examine? Absolutely. Now, I'm sure Mr. Lack of Facts is going to add other lines of evidence. This, in and of itself, is not evidence. I mean, it is possible for scholars to be wrong, correct? The first scholar that the prosecution presented was Bart Ehrman. But Bart Ehrman has been wrong about things in the Gospels before.
He points out a supposed historical error. He writes, their ignorance of Palestinian geography and Jewish customs suggests they composed their works somewhere else in the empire. Mark 7:3 indicates that the Pharisees and all the Jews washed their hands before eating so as to observe the tradition of the elders. This is not true. Most Jews did not engage in this ritual. Now, specifically, Ehrman is referring to Exodus 30:18 through 21, 40:30 through 32, and Leviticus 21 through 16, where only the priest and not the rest of Israel are called upon to follow hand-washing practices. Yet, did the Jews of Jesus' time, influenced by the Pharisees' practices, engage in this ritual despite the fact that it wasn't in the written law? Well, the Jewish evidence says yes. There's an Alexandrian Jew named Aristeas who lived in the 2nd or 3rd century BC who wrote in a letter, as is all the custom of the Jews, they wash their hands in the sea and pray to God. Now, when somebody brought this up in Bart's comment section on his blog, he admitted his mistake, and I'll give him some props there for sure. But the majority of people who read Jesus Interrupted won't see Bart's mea culpa blog post. Hopefully it'll be corrected in future editions. Now,
so scholars can be wrong. And you may say, well, this is a bunch of scholars. But now we've stepped into the realm of logical fallacies. Argumentum ad populum. Here is atheist activist Matt Dillahunty, who would claim the Gospels are anonymous, but here he is addressing this fallacy.
Because whether or not something is true is independent of how many people are convinced of it. For example, do you think the earth is flat?
Well, no, it doesn't.
Okay. Do you think that the Earth is the center of the universe?
Nope.
Yet the overwhelming majority of people who have ever lived believe those things.
So, evidence number one is discredited by the fact that scholars can be wrong, and how many people agree to something doesn't make it correct. So, this claim of evidence gets us nowhere. The claim stands or falls on the evidence, regardless of who agrees with it or how many people say it. No further questions on this. Fine. I called the Gospels themselves to the stand. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all internally anonymous. None of the authors declare within the text itself that they are the author of the Gospels.
None of the Gospels actually explicitly names their authors. The closest we get is the Gospel of John, saying that the beloved disciple was the one who wrote these things.
Even Christians admit this.
While you're reading Mark, if you read through the 16 chapters, the skeptics will point this out. And never does he say, and I, Mark, wrote this gospel.
One of the reasons the traditional authorship of the Gospels is denied is because none of them internally mention an author, either in the preface or main body. Thus, the Gospels are by definition internally anonymous.
So we know the fact that the Gospels did not identify themselves within the text itself, and this gives credibility to the fact that they were originally circulated anonymously. No further questions. Defense, would you again like to cross-examine? Sure. What Mr. Lack of Facts forgot to tell you is that it was actually very common for histories and biographies to be internally anonymous, without the work actually circulating anonymously. For example, Xenophon didn't include his name or any pseudonym in his work, The Anabasis. Josephus didn't include his name in Antiquity of the Jews. This is the same with the works of Polybius, Diodorus, Horarian, Sally, Livy, Tacitus. Even Julius Caesar did not put his name in the text on his commentaries of the Civil War. As a matter of fact, Julius Caesar wrote completely in the third person, which is something that we see in the Gospels. Elmar Herkimer, in his dissertation, noted that this practice was the standard norm. And this becomes even stronger when you look at the genre of ancient Greco-Roman biographies, which appears to be the genre the Gospels were written in. It was common for those type of biographies to be internally anonymous. Philo didn't include his name in his biographical works on Abraham, Joseph, or Moses. In Plutarch's Parallel Lives, he doesn't make any mention of his name. Tacitus actually wrote a biography of his father-in-law and doesn't include his name anywhere in that biography. Lucian wrote Alexander the False Prophet and doesn't include his name at all. Mr. Lack of Facts also left out the fact that the prologues of ancient technical handbooks often lack the author's name, which is very similar to the book of Luke. Scholar Loveday Alexander says Luke's prologue matches a standard medical or technical prologue from that time, and so it's not strange Luke doesn't mention his name. So the fact that the Gospels were internally anonymous doesn't really say much at all, and it doesn't tell us anything about whether the Gospels were circulated anonymously. No further questions. Mr. Lack of Facts, do you have another witness? I sure do, Your Honor. I call any claim of traditional authorship from the 1st century to the stand. Bueller. Well, it seems this witness is MIA, Your Honor, and that is exactly the evidence I am presenting. We don't have any evidence of traditional authorship until the 2nd century. Objection, Your Honor. He has no witness and he's just testifying and making assumptions based on an argument from silence. Sustained. Mr. Lack of Facts, you need to call another witness if you want evidence entered. Fine. I call biblical scholar Dan McClellan to the stand. Mr. McClellan, what is the first record of traditional authorship we have?
Now, the first person to actually assign traditional authorship to the 4 Gospels as we know them today was Irenaeus of Lyons, who was writing around 180 CE, so a full century or more after the composition of the Gospels.
Clearly, this was not the original authorship and was just invented later. No further questions. Mr. All the Facts, your witness. So, Mr. McClellan, can you tell me what Justin Martyr called the Gospels around the middle of the 2nd century?
Justin Martyr, for instance, writing around the middle of the 2nd century CE, just calls them the Memoirs of the Apostles.
So he calls them the Memoirs of the Apostles. Interesting. Now, memoir in English is a word that means a historical account or biography written from personal knowledge or special sources. Now that's English. Justin Martyr wrote in Greek. Memoirs in Greek translates the Greek word apomnemonidis, You'll have to forgive me for my pronunciation there. And it means a recounting, a summarizing, or a commemoration. The Gospels clearly focus on Jesus. They are about Jesus. The apostles are mentioned, but they're not the main characters of the story. The Gospels clearly are about Jesus, not the apostles. So it would be weird for Justin Martyr to be saying that the Gospels are the recounting or summarizing or commemoration of the apostles, as in they were about them rather than Jesus. So when he says of the apostles, he is speaking of them being the ones who are doing the recounting and the summarizing and the commemorating. So by calling the Gospels this, he is saying that the content within these Gospels is the recounting of the apostles themselves or someone directly connected to them. This means that even before Irenaeus, Justin Martyr seemed to have in mind apostolic authorship, or at least authors connected to the apostles. This was around 30 years before Irenaeus. And during the first century, we know Paul's letters were circulating among the churches. And when someone delivered the letter, they would be able to identify where that letter came from. In the same way, when the Gospels were being circulated among the churches, the person delivering the gospel would be able to identify where it came from. It is unlikely they would have accepted any old writing without believing it came from a reliable source. Papias, writing around the turn of the century, stated that he did not give stock, or much stock, to any tradition that was not traceable to a reliable source like a disciple of Jesus or a known elder. No further questions for now. The prosecution rests.
Mr. All the Facts, are you ready to call your first witness?
Yes, I call Marcion of Sinope to the stand. Marcion of Sinope was a heretic in the early 2nd century. Marcion preached that God had sent Jesus, who was a different God and distinct from the vengeful God of the Old Testament. Marcion believed Paul was the only true apostle of God, and he denied that Jesus even came in the flesh and believed that Jesus' body was only an imitation made to appear real, but was never actually real. So he denied Jesus came in the flesh and therefore did not physically die or physically rise from the dead. Marcion is interesting because he was the first person to codify a Christian canon, and his canon consisted of only 11 books, and they were grouped in 2 different sections. The first section is called the Evangelicon, which that was a shortened version, edited version of the Gospel of Luke. And the other section was called the Apostolicon, which was a selection of 10 of Paul's epistles, and they were also edited. But here's the key. Marcion tried to pass that gospel off anonymously. Tertullian actually addresses this in his writing Against Marcion, Book 4. And here's what Tertullian said. Marcion, on the other hand, you must know, ascribes no author to his gospel, as if it could not be allowed him to affix a title to that from which it was no crime, in his eyes, to subvert the very body. And here I might now make a stand and contend that a work ought not to be recognized which holds not its head erect, which exhibits no consistency, which gives no promise of credibility from the fullness of its title and the just profession of its author. Tertullian mocks Marcion for even trying to slip in a gospel anonymously with no title or name on it. Remember, Marcion edited this before Irenaeus had attributed the 4 Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Tertullian is mocking Marcion for thinking he could pass around an anonymous gospel and it be accepted. This clearly indicates that the church was not just accepting anonymous gospels or anonymous works without knowing the source behind it. But Marcion ends up telling us something else very interesting. Even though Marcion passed his gospel around anonymously, they were still able to trace who wrote it. They were able to trace it back to its author. And that's not just from one location. People all over the known world at the time were able to trace it back to Marcion. Irenaeus writes against Marcion in France, Tertullian's in North Africa. An anonymous gospel tried to slip into the church, and they could trace it back to its source. They were smarter than Mr. Lacafax wants to give them credit for, and if there were anonymous gospels, they would be able to trace it to the source. No further questions.
Mr. Lacafax, do you want to cross-examine?
But Marcion was a heretic, so who trusts him anyways? No further questions. Then I call my next witness, the Book of Hebrews. The Book of Hebrews was truly an anonymous book. We actually have manuscripts that are anonymous, manuscripts with no title on them, even though we have the entire beginning of the book. Now, it is possible that the early church knew the author and then it was forgotten over time. But as far as we know, based on the evidence, it was anonymous. With the book of Hebrews, we see two very important pieces of data that relate to the Gospels. Because this work was anonymous, there was actually debate in the early church whether to consider it scripture or to consider it canonical or authoritative. In the late 2nd century, around 170 to 180 AD, the Muratorian fragment shows that the book of Hebrews was actually not even included in the earliest canon of the early church. This was after Marcion gave his heretical canon. The church actually came to an official agreement on a canon after that. And Hebrews not being included would be expected if it was truly anonymous. But we do not see any such debate with the four Gospels. From the earliest records we have, the four Gospels were always considered authoritative, and they were virtually undisputed, which is not what you would expect from something that was anonymous. The second thing we see with Hebrews is that the claims of authorship over Hebrews varied among the early church. Because Hebrews was anonymous, there were debates about who the author actually was. Multiple theories actually came up in the early church. Instead of just picking one author and attributing it to that one author and everybody agreeing, they admitted, we don't know for sure. And multiple authors were suggested and debated about. Papyrus 46 indicates Paul was the author. Tertullian attributed it to Barnabas. Eusebius wrote that Origen said Paul was the author. Others attributed it to Luke, some attributed it to Clement of Rome. This makes sense to have this debate if it's anonymous. It's what we would expect to see. But we don't see this at all with the four Gospels. We have unanimous agreement on the authors of the Gospels. So the book of Hebrews gives us evidence of how an anonymous work was handled among the early church, from debating whether it was even authoritative to ascribing various authors to it and not just one author and everybody agreeing. But we don't see that same thing with the Gospels, which would be indicating that they are not anonymous. No further questions.
Your witness, Mr. Lackafax.
Well, I object because I don't know how to respond to that.
Overruled.
I call the anonymous manuscripts we found of the Gospels. Well, in that case, I call the manuscripts that show the traditional authors. The claim that the Gospels went around anonymously originally is just not supported by the manuscript evidence. We have found no anonymous manuscripts. All of our manuscripts in which the title page has been found have the traditional author's name on it. The idea of anonymous Gospels just isn't supported by the evidence. It's just speculation. No further questions.
Failure imminent.
I call Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If the Gospels were being falsely attributed to authorities to give them credibility, which is a silly argument to begin with because the attribution supposedly is coming much, much later. These Gospels were already used in services, were already treated authoritatively well before Irenaeus ever claimed that it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it doesn't make sense that we need to go back and attribute it to give them authority when they're already treated authoritatively. But let's set that aside for a moment. If they're being attributed to these authorities to give them credibility, why would you choose Matthew, Mark, and Luke? John would make sense. He was one of the inner circle of Jesus, was an apostle. That would make sense. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Matthew was an apostle, but it's widely recognized that Matthew's gospel was specifically written to the Jews. But Matthew was a tax collector. He was hated by the Jewish people. He would not be the logical choice if you were falsely attributing it to an authority to choose the tax collector to be the author of the gospel to the Jews. That's illogical. And Mark and Luke were not even disciples. They are just people who traveled with the apostles. And Luke didn't even travel with one of the disciples. He traveled with Paul, who in his lifetime hadn't actually met Jesus physically. And Luke was a Gentile. Why not just attribute the Gospels to Peter or James or Andrew or Nathaniel or Philip or at least one of the 12 disciples? Why not attribute it to Paul instead of a companion of Paul? It just doesn't make sense. No further questions. My last witness, though I could call plenty more, but I think I've made my case, is the text of the Gospels themselves. Within the text of the Gospels themselves, the authors don't directly identify themselves, but there is evidence that would seem to support the traditional authorship. For example, in Matthew was a tax collector. So it's interesting that the Gospel of Matthew mentions finances and Jesus' comments on money more than any other gospel. It's actually a very prominent theme in the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew's gospel is the only gospel that records the incident of those who collect the temple tax coming up to Peter and asking why Jesus doesn't pay the temple tax. This detail obviously fits with a tax collector's perspective. With the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel seems to internally have a Petrine influence, which means being influenced by Peter. In ancient writing, sometimes a writer would use a technique called inclusio. An inclusio pattern is one in which a paragraph or even a longer portion ends in a similar way than it begins. In historical and biographical works, authors would use this pattern technique to show who their eyewitnesses were, who their sources were. And that way they wouldn't have to stop the story to say, I got this information from so-and-so. It would include the person's name at the beginning and ending of their work. And we see this in the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 1, verse 16, Peter is listed as the very first disciple mentioned. And he's mentioned 4 times in chapter 1, while the other disciples mentioned are only mentioned twice in that chapter. Then at the end, in Mark 16, verse 7, the angel at the tomb tells the women, go tell the disciples and Peter. This is odd wording. Is Peter not one of the disciples? Why didn't they just say, go tell the disciples? That would include Peter. But they separate Peter. Why? Because Mark is trying to show who his source is. It's like Mark's trying to fit the name Peter there, inclusio. Peter is actually referenced in Mark more than any other gospel. A bunch of times in Mark, Peter speaks, but then Jesus responds and answers to the entire group, which is a way of indicating this is Peter's perspective. It's Peter is recounting what happened, but he's saying that, this is me speaking. This is what I said. It's Peter's perspective. This is different than how any of the other gospels recount these events. Peter seems to have a special place in the telling of the story in Mark. So why is Peter significant to the authorship of Mark? Because Mark traveled with Peter as his interpreter. In 1 Peter 5:13, Peter calls Mark his son, like Paul calls Timothy his son. This means Mark and Peter would have been close. And it makes sense that if Mark was writing this gospel, Peter would be his source. So the internal evidence shows that Peter was the source of this gospel, and it would make sense that Mark would be the author if that was the case. What about Luke? Luke was a physician. And as I already pointed out, scholar Loveday Alexander says that Luke's prologue matches a standard medical or technical prologue from that time. Luke is the only gospel to include Jesus saying the phrase, you will surely say unto me this proverb, physician, heal yourself. This statement made by Jesus would stand out to a physician, so it would make sense that he would include that in his writings if he was a physician. In the Gospel of Luke, the miracles of Jesus are often described with medical terms, which again would make sense if the author was a physician. The book of Acts is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke. The evidence shows it's written by the same author. In the book of Acts, the writer says we multiple times when talking about Paul traveling. So it seems that the author was a traveling companion of Paul, which Luke was. What about the Gospel of John? The Gospel identifies the beloved disciple as the author or source of the Gospel. The Gospel says that the beloved disciple was at the Last Supper of Jesus. The Synoptic Gospels tell us that the only people at this Last Supper were the 12 disciples. This puts the beloved disciple as one of the 12 disciples. In chapter 21, the beloved disciple is one of 7 of the disciples mentioned. Since Peter, Thomas, and Nathanael are mentioned in chapter 21, verse 2, it seems obvious that none of them are the beloved disciple. On top of this, of the sons of Zebedee in chapter 21, verse 2, James can't be the beloved disciple. He was martyred during the reign of Herod Agrippa and did not live long enough to lend credence to the belief that he would not die. John and James are not mentioned by name in the gospel, which would be strange unless you're John writing this. James is your brother, and you don't mention yourself except calling yourself the beloved disciple, so you call them the sons of Zebedee. And when you look at the stories, the beloved disciple is always in the company of Peter. Peter and John were part of the inner circle of Jesus, so it would make sense they would be together. So it's clear from the internal evidence of these Gospels that the traditional authors would be the actual authors of these Gospels along with all the other evidence. The defense rests.
Since Mr. Lacofax is cowering under the table, Mr. All the Facts, would you like to give your closing statement?
At the end of the day, there's not really any compelling evidence that would support the claim that the Gospels were originally anonymous. The data seems to indicate they were not. The claim of anonymity is just an attempt to make the Gospels not eyewitness accounts, so that it can be easier to reject the claims made within the Gospels. But an argument from silence, the whole well, we don't have their names listed before the 2nd century argument is just not a strong enough argument to convict of anonymity. And this silence is really probably just due to the fact that it was already agreed upon fact who wrote the Gospels, and no one saw a need to put it in writing beforehand. But after Marcion edited the Gospel and tried to pass it off anonymously, the need to write about the authors of the Gospels became more clear. And that is when you see people start clearly identifying them. With all this data, the evidence seems to show that they were never actually anonymous. And with this, you must vote not guilty of anonymity. You are my jury. What do you think? Comment down below. If you haven't already subscribed, click that subscribe button, click the notification bell. I hope you enjoyed this fun little way of presenting the data. I'll see you next time.